Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be here on this Thursday. I want to welcome you to the Women in Data Science at UC Berkeley conference. My name is Claudia von Baccano, and I'm the Executive Director of the Social Sciences D-Lab, as well as the Digital Humanities here at UC Berkeley. And I'm very excited to welcome everyone today. As people are trickling in, I am going to start just going over some housekeeping issues. So we can go on to the second slide. First, I just want to be very grateful to everyone who is supporting this effort. We have come together from different organizational units on campus, and OneIT in particular, which is a massive organization under Jen Stringer, our CIO. And as you see here, many different units that exist either under the Computing, Data Science, and Society division, or separate from the division, have come together to create a wonderful program for you today. So big thanks to all of our sponsors and participating organizations. And I want to thank the planning committee, many of whom are here today. Again, we have some wonderful graduate students, such as Alicia, and we have Amy Neeser from Research IT, Doris Schauberg from the iSchool, and of course, Erin Foster, our Research Data Management Program Manager, Service Manager. And the Research Data Management Program straddles both the library and Research IT. And many other members, including Liliana Cardil from the Division of Computing, Data Science, and Society. So thank you to all the committee, Liza Schlosser Allroyd as well from the Academic Innovation Studio. And thank you so much, particularly for the undergraduate and graduate students who I know you don't have a lot of time, and your dedication to this effort is greatly appreciated. So thank you everyone for working together on this effort. And we have a code of conduct. We definitely want everyone to participate and engage, particularly today. This is the networking day. And so we want to make sure that we hear your voices, that you participate with us. And we want you to be thoughtful. Step forward if you haven't spoken, step back if you've said something, and create a really safe, inclusive, and welcoming environment for every type of person, whether we're queer or BIPOC, people of color, transgender. It doesn't matter what background. We should all feel empowered to say what our opinions and thoughts are, and let them rest and be respected, and at the same time engaging in dialogue and hopefully interesting discussion. So just please try to be considerate and respectful and collaborative, and always refrain from demeaning or discriminatory or harassing behavior. That's something that we really want to be thoughtful about in this environment and in every environment at UC Berkeley. It's an issue that we need to address and be really, really conscious of. And if you are being trolled or harassed or bothered by someone, please do feel safe in doing some anonymous reporting. We'd be very, very glad that you did that. And we'll be doing some active monitoring throughout the week. So thank you. We take these things very seriously. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness in this regard. We are recording today, so if you do not feel comfortable being recorded, please turn your camera off. We always love to see your beautiful faces and your participation and engagement. It makes it much more lively. But we completely understand if you don't have strong Wi-Fi or for some reason it's going to be challenging for you to have your camera on. Please do stay muted while others are speaking because that can interfere. And then place your questions in the chat. Tweet often, please, so that others know about this great event and that it's happening. And with that, I will start the panel. All right, well, thank you so much for joining me today. I am so honored to be here with a very distinguished panel. Each member of this panel has distinguished themselves by leading into who they are as thinkers and as scholars, and have found their authentic voices. Much like Dr. Vivian Ming before them on Tuesday's keynote, they see a problem with data science research and instruction as a monolith, and they're committed to deeply exploring the phenomena and constructs at play in their research. They delve into complex ideas in their instruction, challenging normative notions. I feel very much aligned with their approach as the principal investigator of a computational social media research project. We've developed a different kind of methodology and approach to machine learning that starts with theorization and interpretation, rather than, as Dr. Ming stated on Tuesday, throwing data at algorithms. So it's a great pleasure to introduce the panel, and I will introduce all of the panel and then give them an opportunity to say a few words, and then we'll engage in dialogue. Just to say, again, I'm Claudia Fombacano. I'm the Executive Director of the Social Sciences D-Lab and Digital Humanities at Berkeley. I also work on a computational social science research project currently focused on hate speech that combines item response theory with deep learning. With the lead author there, Chris Kennedy, and another author is Renata Barreto Montenegro. It's my pleasure to work very closely with Renata, a legal scholar who focuses on the impact of policy on sex workers online. And she's currently a graduate student at the law school and at UC Berkeley and a D-Lab community member. She is pursuing and is a candidate for both a JD and a PhD, which is incredibly ambitious. Somehow she still finds a way to really bring her whole person into the D-Lab work, into instruction, into the research, and into consulting. She's also had the opportunity to intern at Twitter and Facebook. She's a wonderful contributor to another project, which is a project that we're working on with the Social Science Research Council. We're also joined today by Professor Rochelle Terman, who was instrumental in establishing our D-Lab text analysis working group. She spearheaded a wonderful course within the political science department to grow expertise in computational social science and humanities. After being a postdoc at Stanford, she's joined the University of Chicago as assistant professor. She really pays special attention to issues of human rights. And finally, we are joined by Professor Laura K. Nelson, who's an assistant professor at Northeastern and a core faculty at the New Lab for Texts and Maps and Networks. She was also a postdoc for Digital Humanities and BIDS at UC Berkeley, and she studies social movements, culture, gender, institutions, and organizations. Laura and Rochelle, if I may use their first names, are both alumna of UC Berkeley, and I am extremely excited to welcome them back. So today I want to invite you to explore in what ways you place issues of equity and justice at the center of your research and instruction. What does it mean to operationalize equity and justice within your methods? And how do you address bias in your research design? And how do you teach data science in a way that is empowering and not limiting? I also would like you to be thoughtful about the way that you have built networks of support and communities of learning. So I'll turn it over to Professor Nelson first for some remarks.
Thank you, Claudia. I'm really thrilled to be back here in this community. In fact, this is one of the communities in my networks of support that keeps me going, even as I have moved physically away from UC Berkeley. It keeps me going. So I'm really just thrilled to be in this wonderful community here. So I just want to take, about 5 minutes to talk about my experience thus far in data science and specifically computational social science, which is my kind of subfield in data science. So much of the data science and computational social science that I see most visibly, which means they're published in major outlets like Nature, Science, Science Advances, and they're taught in the kind of dominant data science courses in the major universities across the nation and internationally, is of a particular type of data science or computational social science. They ask a particular set of questions, they use kind of this restrained number of data sets, and they have a very specific epistemology. In the social sciences, so in the published articles in the social sciences, it's often on a limited data set such as Twitter, the Web of Science, or the patents data set. Those are kind of the early big data sets that people were using. And the goal of this early work was to uncover natural social laws, so universal laws governing society that hold across all times, all cultures, all places. It's often, particularly in the political sciences, it's often in this kind of positivist causal inference framework, typically covering questions that were previously addressed using inferential statistics. So because of this kind of visible work, that is what a lot of people who are outside of data science who are coming into the field associate with data science. So they see this framework as the dominant framework in data science. But there's really no natural or inevitable association between these methods and the way it's being used in this kind of most visible spaces here. It's largely because the specific people who have been kind of first to jump on board with these methods have long been embedded in that framework, so they kind of ported over to these new methods, and that's what we're seeing. And also the early available data like Twitter and Web of Science have guided the methods a lot in there. So what I try to do with my research and my teaching is to challenge this dominant paradigm. We don't have to do it this way. It's not inevitable. We can do it very differently. Trying to force things like machine learning into the causal inference paradigm and inferential statistics is actually not working very well. These scholars are frustrated. They're frustrated because machine learning doesn't replicate regression analysis, and they can't figure out how to make machine learning replicate regression analysis. And for those who are trying to build systems, so practitioners at Facebook, at Twitter, who are trying to deploy this in like production level uses, they get stalled because they absorb bias. Like there's biases in this system. So if you're training machine learning algorithms on social data, it's going to reproduce the biases in society, and then they don't know what to do with that. So there's been a lot of frustration about trying to force these methods into that paradigm. Machine learning algorithms, AI, will absorb the biases that are present in the data. We know that. That's what they're designed to do. They're supposed to learn patterns from the data. If it's social data, there will be social biases in the data, and it will be transferred into the patterns. We know that. If anyone was surprised by this, if anyone was surprised that machine learning is biased, they either don't understand the method or they don't understand the data. But I see this as an opportunity. I think this is a fantastic result of machine learning because it allows us to understand cultural biases, the biases that are embedded in the very language and interactions we have that reproduce inequality. So this allows us to understand these biases and also to devise systems that counter them. So we know where society is, we know where we want society to be, and now we can start to bridge kind of that gap. But to do so, we need to approach it in a different way. We need to approach it with different questions, with different data, to think about representation in our data, to think about who we're studying and why, and how we're doing it. Specifically, I like to do inductive cultural work, intersectionality, kind of this qualitative research framework. I think we can get much, much more out of these methods if we throw out positivist, inferential statistics, the way people have been doing it thus far, and we really open it up to the exciting epistemologies that come from intersectional scholars, come from Black feminists, they come from critical race theories. that alignment, the critical race, intersectionality, Black feminist theories can align with machine learning in a very powerful way if we don't get stuck in the inferential statistics paradigm. So that's what I try to do with my research. I publish papers on it. I try to teach in that way. So I make sure that the papers that I'm teaching are not all in that framework. And I'm hoping to invite more people into this alternative way of doing things and to build networks of support, conferences, papers, so that we can build that and put it on the same ground as what has now become the dominant framework in data science. I will stop there and let others speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think a lot of what you're saying really resonates, and I think it's so appropriate to the times. There's a lot of discussion on campus currently to really interrogate the data sets that we're using and to really challenge what, what's missing, who's counted, who's not counted, and to really go deeply in understanding those data sets, but also the way that we interrogate the data sets. Professor Terman, I'm sure you have a lot to add in this area, both in terms of research, but you have particularly done a lot in the area of instruction and developing instructional programs. So how do you go about this through, how do you teach a different approach through in data science?
Yeah, thank you, Claudia, and to my fellow panelists and to the organizing committee for putting on this great series of events. I know, and to the audience as well, I know that one more Zoom meeting is not to be underappreciated. So we're really looking forward to having the conversation. Yeah, so I thought let me use my time to respond to Claudia's question about teaching and mentoring. The last 5 years, we've seen an explosion of data science and computational science classes and programs, which is fantastic around the country. Berkeley's obviously been a leader in that. And so I wanted to offer some reflections on the way that we teach and mentor the new generation of data scientists and computational social scientists. As I thought the way to do that would be to raise 3 questions that we could kind of puzzle out together. So the first question is, who is the data scientist in training? What do they work on substantively? What are their backgrounds, both technically as well as demographically? What do they want to do with their newfound skills? Why are they taking courses or training in this area? I think that by now we kind of, at least I hope that we recognize that the data scientist in training or the computational social scientist in training is not only limited to students with a computer science background. And hopefully we've come to recognize that folks with a social science background, perhaps graduate students in social sciences, are also absolutely key and necessary to bring in to this community. But I think that we have some ways to go in expanding the tent and recognizing the importance of doing that. So for example, when I taught this course, Computing for the Social Sciences and Digital Humanities at Berkeley, we had students, I think, from like over 8 programs. We had students from art, we had students from literature, we had students from African American studies. We had students from interpretivist sociology, like Laura. She did not actually take the class, but her, she could probably have taught the class, but following in Laura's footsteps. So why is this important? It's not only just to add our kind of token diversity, but it actually, these students have they utilize these skills in incredibly impressive and creative ways and to generate innovative insights in their own fields. And they also show the community at large both what we can do with these skills, so it actually expands the potentiality of some of these techniques, but also shows us some of the biases and limitations, as Laura was mentioning earlier. So I guess the lesson there would be to expand our notion of who the computational social scientist is and what she, he, or they work on. The second question is, what is the goal of training? What is our pedagogical goal? What are we actually trying to achieve? And at first brush, you might think that this is kind of an obvious question. It's just to teach students. But I think that at least the way that it has been done for a long time, the goal was emphatically, like in reality, not to teach students. It was to weed students out in order to find the 2 or 3 students that the instructor felt were worthy to work with them, and so on. And once we shift gears to be like, okay, our goal is to actually teach, then I think a lot of some other things come into play. So for example, prerequisites, how do we think about prerequisites and the difference between a weeder approach and a teaching approach? Well, a weeder approach would often, put in some kind of line in the course curriculum, like, we expect, I saw a course on R that was actually teaching R that said in the course description, we assume a basic familiarity with R. So it's like, well, then what is the point of this class? But also, I think that sometimes that those prerequisites can actually be used as kind of a liability waiver to say like, okay, we're gonna say in the course description, we're gonna assume a basic familiarity with R, but oftentimes the instructor knows that a lot of students will ignore that and take the class anyway, and they're actually perfectly fine with that. But the students that do ignore that tend to be of a particular type. So we know from social science research, again and again, that if you add a prerequisite, both in a classroom, but also, for example, a job, men will apply if they have like, 20 to 50% of those items, and women will tend to apply if they only have 80 to 100% of those items. So if our goal is to really to teach, then we have to kind of rethink both what we expect students to know coming in, and also then what we actually have to teach them and how. So that was kind of the third question, is what should be part of the curriculum? Well, how are we actually going to approach our pedagogical technique? And here, I think one of the lessons is to question what I call autodidact chauvinism, which is to basically say, okay, you got to just learn some of these things on your own. So for example, I saw a computer science class recently where all of the homeworks were to be submitted by GitHub and Git, and they didn't actually teach Git or GitHub. And so what does this kind of do? Well, it just, it doesn't actually, filter or just have this kind of barrier by which you assess students and only the best students can achieve that. The only thing that it does is kind of psychologically weed out students of a particular demographic and background, not actually the best students, but just students of a particular background. This also holds for assessment as well. And here I'll kind of switch from a classroom to a job setting, like if you're trying to hire for a job. So another kind of anecdote, I was on a committee that was hiring an instructional faculty member, and some of the questions that the candidates were asked were, are you familiar with Python? Okay. What's wrong with that question? Are you familiar with Python? Well, in the first case, it's incredibly vague, right? I mean, it could mean anything. And it's completely relies on self-assessment, right? So for example, someone could have taken, a 2-week course on Python and say, yeah, I'm familiar with Python. Another person could have been working with Python in an industry setting, for years. But because they, haven't written some of the canonical packages or something that, or, they're comparing themselves to a certain type, then they'll say, I'm not that familiar with Python. But probably a more problematic aspect of that question is by relying on self-assessment, you're doing the same thing with advantaging a certain kind of person, namely a very confident kind of person, perhaps an overconfident kind of person. I just kind of, that will have, as we know, some implications for equity and inclusion in terms of who we hire. So I'll leave it there. There's a lot more to say about those questions. Who's the data scientist student? What do they actually need to know before coming to class, and how should we teach them? But I'm looking forward to puzzling those questions out more in the conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Turman. I think that, yes, I think that you're hitting one of the key issues, right? Is that as women of color, we tend to battle as women, first of all, and as women of color, second, this intersectional issue. And then if we're queer and we have other identities as immigrants, et cetera, second language learners, we tend to battle imposter syndrome at a whole other level, right? That we assume that a job is not for us. We assume that a class is not for us. We assume that we're underprepared, undervalued, and unseen. And then when we're presented with certain data sets that speak about us in ways that stereotype us as impoverished and lacking whatever, then that's reinforced not only within our own minds, but also within the context of that course. People might look at us in a way that is not going to feel the same as another member of that class or a person who is in that workforce. So things like imposter syndrome require a significant amount of actually working through and thinking through and writing through those insecurities. Yeah, so I really appreciate the fact that you're also bringing forward pedagogy. As someone who holds a doctorate and a master's from Berkeley and Stanford in pedagogy and education, the pedagogy is hugely undervalued in the higher education environment. And so I really appreciate that, yes, good, strong pedagogy takes a lot of planning work and thoughtfulness and analysis. So all great, really wonderful considerations. I much appreciate that. I'm going to turn now to Renata Barreto. And I know Renata is doing really important research. And so I want to give her an opportunity to discuss the type of research that she's doing, because she's really looking at a population that I think is rarely focused in on. So Renata, if you can respond to the different questions on the table right now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Claudia. So I'm going to start off by giving you all kind of a narrative of my journey into data science, which I think is kind of unconventional, and specifically into this new field of AI ethics. So I'm an immigrant, and I'm the daughter of immigrants as well. I came to the US when I was 6 years old. And that has entailed having just not only having like bilingual capacity, but also bicultural capacity, being able to move between different worlds. And one year I was going to Brazil, I think this was in 2013, I was going to Brazil for the summer with my family. I had stayed there for about 3 to 4 months, and I was coming back into the States. Specifically, I was going through the Houston International Airport. And as an immigrant and as a child of immigrants, airports are pretty common places for me, but they're also places that they're spaces of violence against people who don't look like their traditional sort of American norm. So I have both this like comfort and discomfort with airports. And I was passing through customs to try to get into the country. And I had noticed that they had just rolled out these kiosks. So normally when you go through customs, you have to speak to an immigration officer. They ask you, where you've been, why you've been there, how long you've been out, a host of questions. But instead of doing that, they had these automated passport kiosks, this new technology where you go in front of this kiosk, you scan your passport, and it takes a picture of you with not just like your biometrics, but also information about where you came from, and it runs it through some sort of unseen algorithm, right? And I noticed that as soon as I got my receipt back, because it prints out a receipt and it tells you next steps, I had this giant red X on my receipt with a photo of me. And it told me that I had to go for further questioning with an immigration officer. So I'm starting to go into further questioning. I'm noticing that there are these two lines forming. One line where it's mainly white folks who don't really seem to have sort of international ties. And another line, and mind you, these are all not immigrants, these are all citizens. We're all in the citizenship sort of queue to go through customs. But this other line was composed of people of color, people who might have been white, but they had children of color from like different backgrounds. So I started putting on my social scientist hat and wondering what's going on here. Like, why is this division happening? What's causing this sort of bifurcation? And how can we find out? So I went through to speak to the customs officer, and I asked him, like, why am I in this line? Why am I being flagged for further questioning? And he told me that it was because of my last name. So my last name is conjoined. I have um, uh, this what's it called, like a slash in between the two names, and that's pretty common for people from Latin American countries or who have sort of this tradition of using two last names, but it's kind of uncommon within the States. So the way that the system was designed, based on what the officer was telling me, it wasn't able to process people who had this dual last name category. It just didn't see it as normal, so it needed further flagging to kind of figure out what was wrong. And that really prompted me to start asking questions about these machine learning models that were happening in the background, because I was able to get this information from the officer, but I wasn't able to get any formal information from TSA. We really didn't know if there was some sort of, I wondered if something in my image, right, in the photo that they took of me, and I was assuming that they were going to compare it to my passport photo, maybe something went wrong there. All of these questions really prompted me to apply to graduate school, where I could get more training to kind of figure out what's going on under the hood. And I joined graduate school in a time when these questions were really, really nascent. This was in 2015, and no one had really looked at what was happening to immigrants. The reason why was because there weren't people in this like burgeoning field of AI ethics who really had as much had like this type of background. So I think it goes back to this question of diversity and representation as an end goal, not just because it's an end goal that's important for itself, which it definitely is, but also because people get to come at these research questions from different angles, different perspectives that are informed by their lived experiences. And there's a ton of literature in the AI ethics space that talks about how marginalized communities are the first ones that experience these new types of surveillance tactics. They're the ones that really are at the forefront. And then these surveillance tactics are generalized to the rest of the public as time goes on. So we're seeing a lot of women of color, queer people in the AI ethics space because of these sorts of lived experiences with dominant technological approaches that are built without input from these populations. So my journey into AI ethics has really been informed by those types of experiences, and it's forced me to ask questions that are coming more from a critical perspective, that ask about the limits and kind of the gaps in machine learning models specifically. I've joined a PhD program that's highly qualitative in nature. It's this Law and Society program. So we ask questions about how laws inform society and how society informs the law. So rather than taking the law just like as a discrete unit of analysis that we just take as given, we don't ask questions about the assumptions behind the laws, which is what a lot of doctrinal classes do. My program really tries to understand why is this happening? Should this be happening? Normative questions that have really gone unanswered when it comes to doctrinal thinking. And I bring that sort of approach into data science as well. I remember in my first statistics class that I took as a graduate student at Berkeley, we were asking questions about the data sets that we were using to learn how to use R, for example, as Professor Terman mentioned. And the data sets were, we were looking at gender. So social scientists, of course, care lots about demographic background and how that leads to different sort of life outcomes. So we were focusing on this question of gender. And I remember that the data had gender as a binary. So this was in 2015. And we pushed back and asked our professor, like, what are the normative implications of having a data set that only uses these two genders? Why don't we have other data sets available to us? Why do we have this sort of binary approach in our methods as well? And at that time, his response was that normative questions were outside of the scope of what we were learning in statistics. That was really surprising to a lot of us because we were coming at this from, like I said, a more critical perspective. And what's really given me some what's really given me some comfort is that we revisited this question with this professor as time went on, and his answer had changed completely. And I think that the reason why this was happening is because there's a movement undergoing data science right now of technologists and social science informed data scientists that are really pushing the field to grapple with not just these like ethical issues, but also with some hidden assumptions behind how and why we do the things that we do. That's led to things like in NeurIPS, for example, which is one of the premier machine learning conferences, to have these broader impact statements for every single research that proposition that was going through their conference. There's been a ton of pushback against that. It's not been widely accepted. There's tons of Twitter feuds on that issue specifically, but I think that the fact that it's gaining so much attention, gaining so much momentum, speaks to the kind of positive power that researchers are trying to have within their own field and within the kind of social impacts that this research is having. This research isn't just bounded by the academy. We're seeing it used in technology companies. We're seeing it used in government. We're seeing it used across all levels of society. Machine learning models and their predictions are being used as the primary decision makers. And so we really need to question the assumptions that these models have built in about the training data, definitely. For example, when there's an imbalance in the types of people that are represented there, we get imbalanced results, but also we need to question the types of methods that are used to analyze these machine learning models. There's a ton of subjectivity that goes into things like hyperparameter tuning, and that sort of subjective bias is something that we're never going to be able to weed out. Every person, every researcher brings their own kind of perspective and bias. And instead of seeing it as something negative, what we need to do is really like encounter it, confront it, and think of ways of including others so we can kind of bring in different perspectives that end up not harming the final output. So those are my thoughts on those questions, Claudia.
So powerful. Thank you so much, Renata. And as a fellow immigrant, everything you're saying really resonates for me. There's so many places we can go, and this has been such a rich already. So many important topics have been brought forth. One thing I wanted to share with folks is our current manuscript for our computational social media research agenda, and specifically applied to hate speech. But to Renata's point, and she's part of our team, that really stopping to think about and theorize first, what is, in this case, hate speech? What is the construct? What is the phenomena? How, to grapple with a team of folks from different disciplines and to think through, operationalize that, interpret and think. We developed an instrument in that through item response theory and measurement theory, to then label a data set and develop a deep learning model that was really taking into consideration each of the interpretive steps. So that manuscript might be of interest to folks here today, that really, I think, models what we're talking about, which is infusing these interpretive steps, infusing theory into the process, and really critically assessing and thinking through, and stopping and going back and forth between a more computationally intensive or data intensive steps to really highly qualitative, immersing ourselves in the data in a way that it really brings a sanity test to the work. So that's one direction. But the other direction that I think is also interesting is, and I know that a question came in, I do want to address it, but to me, something that's come up over and over again is the issue of also data sources and how data sources can be really problematic, and algorithms, and how these algorithms can be really problematic. So we can address the algorithm issue by, developing an algorithm in a very systematic way. This issue has kind of come up with for me because I am working on a diversity and data science at UC Berkeley and replication at Mills and University of Maryland, Baltimore County project. And we're trying to see and understand the kinds of issues that Rochelle was talking about that students grapple with. How are they, when they show up in a classroom, a large classroom that's teaching them data science, how are they grappling with their identity within that context? And recently there was an issue with Piazza and Twitter where a student raised some important issues. And how do we study these issues? How do we study the different complex, you've talked about there's a movement within data science to really counter the normative data science. How do you study that? Or in Laura's case, I know you study social movements. How do you assemble a data set and actually, systematically go through and study that? It's a broad question, but a lot of the data sets that we currently use are very problematic. So how do you address that issue in your own research or in your own work? And I'm looking at you, Laura.
Oh, yep. I was going to jump in. I didn't want to. Yeah. So I actually think, Renata, your last point you made is the absolute key point, which is no data set is going to be perfect. Algorithms will absorb social biases. That's what they do. So it's not like we can produce an algorithm that won't absorb social biases if it's used on social data. What it takes is acknowledging that. It takes just saying, everything is limited. We're making all of these choices about our data, how to structure the data. And if anyone's gathered their own data, it's a nightmare. It's a freaking nightmare. And there's always going to be problems with it. And it's never going to be perfectly representative, and nor really should it, because the perfect data doesn't exist. The perfect algorithm doesn't exist. But if we come into it not with this idea that there's a view from nowhere, which is what feminist theorists have always criticized quantitative methods for, assuming that there's a view from nowhere, there's a perfectly objective stance that's going to capture all the complexities of the social world. Let's throw that out. Get rid of that. That is a ridiculous stance. We should not have that stance. We certainly shouldn't have that stance in data science and AI work. So if we come at it from the opposite perspective, saying we know this is going to be limited, it's only going to capture one perspective or a few perspectives. This is like the Donna Haraway thing, right? Everything is subjective. And the way we get to objectivity is by piecing together different subjectivities. That's the only way to get to objectivity. So I don't think the solution is let's find the perfect data, the perfect this, the perfect that. No, forget it. It's never going to happen. We can say this particular data set has all of these limitations and it's from this perspective and this algorithm is from this perspective. And so the scope conditions are very small, and that's fine. We don't have to claim it does everything. And then we piece together the different subjectivities from, different types of people doing this work, coming at it from different perspectives and different questions. Now we can have a robust data science field where we acknowledge differences and perspectives and bring it together. And that's what feminist theorists have always wanted. And we have the opportunity to do that as long as we don't have people coming in saying, my data is the perfect data, or my perspective is the only perspective. That's when things start to fall apart. So that would be my approach. And that's what I encourage people who I work with to do. It's been around for decades. This perspective has been around for decades. Let's embrace it and really bring it forward.
I want to invite Rochelle to respond as well.
Yeah, I want to, I agree 100%. And I want to echo a couple things that both Laura and Renata called our attention to, which is really important. So one, which is something that Laura just summarized, is that all data is qualitative. All data is qualitative because once you get from a kind of natural social phenomenon to some kind of spreadsheet, that is a qualitative move. And the example that Renata brought up about gender is a beautiful and highly illustrative example. And we've all been there where we're like, go to some kind of data training or something, and they're talking about different types of data. They're talking about categorical data, they're talking about string data, they're talking about binary data, and then they bring up the example of gender. That is a qualitative and normative step that just happened, and not a naturalistic one. And then the other thing that I would say to a point that Renata brought up is that these, both the data and the algorithm, so the algorithm that Renata described at the airport, which I thought was a really powerful example, is I'm sure proprietary, created by some firm somewhere that was contracted to do this. Just like the algorithms that inform sentencing in the justice system, and this kind of dystopic decision about recidivism or whatever that goes into criminal sentencing. These things that are increasingly being used in the public sphere, and they're proprietary and they're hidden and they're thus completely outside the scope of public criticism and accountability. To me, that's just completely unacceptable. And if these algorithms are being used in public services like the airport or in the courtroom, then in my view, they absolutely need to be made open source. I mean, there's just no excuse if it's being used for, if we live in a democratic society, then they need to be held to account. And the only way that can happen is if these now proprietary algorithms and the data, of course, behind them is made open to public and open to public scrutiny. So I'll just bring up those 2 points.
So a question has come in that deals with the reality of being an early career academic, moving towards tenure, and having the pressures of publication. So I'm glad that this question came up, because we have 2 professors who are forging their own paths forward. So, Professor Nelson, Professor Terman, how do you navigate the political landscape and securing your positions and being successful in these reputable universities where you are seeing a lot of success? And what would you say to that, sort of the pressure to publish in journals, and how have you navigated that issue?
I can just start us off by offering a couple thoughts, and I'm reading the question here, and I think it's a absolutely legitimate question that a lot of scholars, graduate students, and early career faculty grapple with. So, for example, in political science, there's been kind of this causal inference revolution, and a widespread belief that unless you do work that has a strong causally identified design, that is just not going to get published. And I think that's true to a big extent. But I, at least in my experience, have found that it's not as true as people think. It's like one of these beliefs that it's kind of a form of intersubjective belief that everyone thinks everyone else thinks it, but they don't themselves think it. So I've talked to a lot of individual people. They're like, well, I support descriptive work and inductive work, but no one else does. And then I talked to another person, they're like, well, I also just support descriptive work and inductive work, but no one else does. And I'll just tell you, I've had a lot of people tell me when I'm doing some inductively oriented data science or computational science that it won't be published in a top journal, so don't even try. And I think that's also, gendered and racialized. And there's always going to be some dude to tell me not to shoot too far or too high. But, I've the times when I've had just a little bit of FU energy And I'm like, I'm just going to shoot for it. And I'm not going to like pretend to be this causal inference person. Like, I'm just going to fully embrace and be completely upfront and transparent that this is not a causally identified project, that that's not the goal, that it is, I'm unabashedly inductive in this or descriptive in this, that's actually landed really, really well, like surprisingly well at top journals well. And I'm not, it's not generalizable. I'm sure like, there have this strategy or whatever has not worked for a lot of people. But at least when I've kind of leaned into it, I've had like surprisingly good results from it. And maybe that's just because I think that there is just a general trend of like a backlash to this causal revolution. Like, I've just talked to a lot of like people in different departments and stuff that are like kind of just whisper in my ear, like, we're sick of it. So I think that I would just suggest to any, I think, burgeoning scholar to just lean into it and to own it, and kind of see how that ends up working for you.
Lean into it, own it, and support your perspective. So machine learning doesn't work for causal inference. It does not work. And so, Matt Solganic published that amazing piece in something where he invited a bunch of machine learning people to come up with like the most sophisticated algorithm to use this huge data set called Fragile Families, where they try to predict later outcomes based on early life outcomes. And there's an amazing Invisibilia podcast on this where they do the reveal live, and he's just floored because none of them work. None of them predict better than logistic regression. So it's not the case that it's like, oh, you guys are doing great work, but we could do this other work. It's like, you're not doing great work. It's not working. And that's where the backlash is coming from. So if you can, I found most success when I say that. I say, look, you guys have tried, but it's just not, it doesn't work with machine learning. And there's this other really powerful perspective. So know your methods, learn as much as you can about all methods, learn causal inference if you have the time, and then throw it back at them and say, no, I thought about it. I could have done it. I didn't do it because of these reasons. And that tends to go far. Of course, there's all sorts of subjectivity issues with, I'm a white woman, so I can say that a little bit more forcefully, and I can, do some things that other people can't. So I understand there's differences there. I also have been denied jobs because they're like, nope, we wanted a causal inference person, and that hurts. I was like, well, crap, that sucks. So yeah, there's real cost to it. Absolutely. Mike, I see your question. I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, so as we're winding down, I have to say I've really seen Professor Nelson and Terman, but also Renata Barreto, like, lean into themselves and to be their full person. I think like professionally and networking wise, if you want a piece of advice, be your full person, and really be true to yourself and your passion, because if you don't, you're going to be miserable anyway. So and I think the academy is changing. I think the environment is changing. So these ideas really resonate. I've seen a lot of people who were told you're not going to get tenure with this approach, get tenure and be very successful in my time. So I think so. If I don't know if there's any verbal questions that want to be asked, but I did also want to kind of give everyone a short kind of closing statement, unless there is no other question coming in. So maybe we could just start. Renata, if you have any closing statements, and if a question comes in, we could quickly address it.
Yeah, just on the point of causal inference, I really recommend the work of Isak Wøller-Haugsmann and Lily Hu. They've been asking this question of what does it mean to control for something like race and gender? And they argue that what these methods are actually doing is controlling for racism, for sexism. And so it kind of turns the question on its head, and it doesn't put the onus of responsibility on the individual or on the subpopulation for not achieving quote unquote success, but instead looks at kind of a structural way of measuring things like racism and sexism. So yeah, I'm not sure if that's much of a closing thought, but just a great recommendation for folks to check out.
And maybe you can address, there's a question coming in. advice for entering data science profession outside of a degree granting pathway?
Yeah, definitely. There are a lot of really great data science courses online that are geared towards non-degree granting certificates and the like. So you could really learn on your own. It's interesting because I think computer science puts this emphasis on the lone geeky male who taught himself coding from age 5 and never really had a formal education, but is this wonder kid. And I think to that extent, they've tried to make a lot of make a lot of this accessible online, but it doesn't always apply to women, right? Like whenever we talk about this genius computer science kid, it's very rarely applied to women or non-binary people. So I would encourage you to just do it on your own because it's really this, it's really a technique, a tool that you can learn through trial and error.
Professor Turman?
Yeah, just to respond quickly to the question, I endorse 100% everything that Renata just said. And I also, going back to kind of the autodidact chauvinism point, is that there are so many things available online. And I think that for me, at least, it's really helped to do them with other people. So for example, like, you know, the community that I like just by happenstance like fell into at Berkeley with Claudia and Laura, like had such a profound impact on my trajectory and on my learning. And I've, you know, have continued to try to do that whenever I want to learn a new skill. I'll ask a buddy, you know, are you interested in learning this new skill with me? And we kind of go through the class together and provide accountability. And I think that it really enhances at least my learning, I think others as well. I love the example also for controlling for race and gender, because you're not supposed to control for post-treatment outcomes, you know? So it's like, what does it mean at all to control for, you know, yeah, it makes no sense. Anyway, but I just, as you know, a closing thought, I just wanted to thank again the committee and for all of you for having this conversation. There's obviously a lot more to be said. But also I would, you know, welcome anyone who's interested or has any follow-up questions to reach out to me. And, you know, hopefully we can continue to have this really important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nelson.
I do want to end on an optimistic note, but just to be a pessimist for a second, I love self-taught learning. That's how I learned these methods because they weren't really being taught when I was a grad student. Google did leak their like hiring memo, and and the people on the AI ethics team at Google have talked about this. There's a major problem with screening at these companies, and they screen out people who are don't have a degree from like 6 universities. And it's really bad. And so the AI team at Google said, you don't get to screen our people. We are going to screen them, because people from Howard University were being screened out just simply from being from Howard. So I don't want to like pretend that you can self-teach your way up into a job in Google, because there are so many structural problems that we need to address. And inside Google and I'm picking on Google, but all of the companies do this. There are people inside these companies who are really fighting back against that. And so we should be supporting them. The new Google, it's not really a union, but it's kind of a union of workers, are pushing back on this. So those are the things we need. Speaking of social movements, that's what we need to be supporting, is the people who are inside these companies who realize these structural problems, and just support them in their ability to fight back. So hold them accountable so Google can't quietly fire them, and not, you know, they need to be held accountable for that. So how do I end on an optimistic note? I don't want to be a pessimist here, but I do want to recognize structural issues and like, yay, we can all learn, but that doesn't fix the problems that are there. Optimistically, the stuff that is going on inside Google and AI and what Renata, what you're doing, it's just, I'm so full of hope for this new generation. It's a completely different world than the one Rochelle and I think we're brought up in, and we're young. So it's like not even that long ago. So it's moving quick. I think there's absolutely an opportunity right now to push and continue the movement and like really just change the way things are doing. And there's so much energy moving in that direction. So we need to keep that going. Twitter, oddly, as toxic as it is a great place to hold people accountable. So
Thank
it.
you so much. I deeply, deeply appreciate you, each of you, for being part of my network, my own personal network, and for extending that network out to anyone out there. I can say optimistically that the dlab.berkeley.edu has many resources for folks, whether they're within a degree-bearing program or not. And we're here for you. So please do reach out to us. We're here to support, to make data science diverse, to think about the issues that are lacking in terms of diversity, and to be vigilant about injustices and the ways that people are being systematically mistreated. So we're holding people to account, and we're going to be here to be vigilant, to have your back. And we ask you to join us in this new movement, as Professor Nelson coined it. So thank you so much to WIDS and to the panel. And with that, I'll turn it over to Liza. Thank you so much.